Hey, let's talk about those conversations we're supposed to be having. You know what I'm talking about, right? You'll remember it wasn't that long ago when we all took to Instagram saying we were gonna stop being silent about racism and speak up and have these challenging conversations. Yeah, so how's that going? Alright, let's be real, these conversations can be pretty hard, and depending who you're talking to, sometimes it can feel like you're talking to a brick wall. I mean, not always. There's some exceptions. I've had some conversations that were really encouraging and caught me by surprise. But for the most part, those are exceptions, not the norm. More often than not, you'll encounter resistance. You'll have people ask, well, what about this? What about that? Black on black crime. I've got these cherry-picked statistics right here. And when you try and have these crucial conversations with somebody who seems to just refuse to get it, it can be super draining, right? Like, you'll probably start wondering, do I even keep going? Is this even worth it? Well, so the very short answer to that is yes. Yes, it is. Okay, now heads up, I am mostly speaking to allies and accomplices here. If you are black and could potentially be re-traumatized by this sort of conversation, that's not really what I'm talking about. And if you're a non-black person of color like myself, each of these conversations, depending on who you're having them with, you might need to just understand the nuances of whether it's time to protect your energy or time to speak up for those who have even less privilege than you do. But for probably most of us watching, here's why having these conversations continues to be important, even when it seems like the other person just won't hear you out. So the reality is, you are unlikely to change anyone's mind about racism just by having a conversation with them. I know, I wish that weren't the case. I wish it were a lot simpler than it really is, but it's pretty well proven that facts, data, empirical evidence perform really poorly when it comes to changing someone's mind. There's this behavioral economist, J.K. Galbraith. He once said that faced with a choice between changing one's mind and proving that there's no need to do so, almost everybody gets busy with the proof. That applies to the person you're talking to, that applies to me, to you. It's a human nature kind of thing. So it's easy to think that when somebody holds beliefs that are false and harmful, that all you gotta do is present them with evidence to the contrary. Give them the right information, the full picture, the full set of data, and they'll get it. So having accurate information is actually really important for human survival. Just think about it. If you don't have the right perception of the world, it's going to be really hard to survive in that world. But you know what's even more important than that? Belonging and having a group around you. That's why people will do mental gymnastics to hold on to inaccurate beliefs if changing those beliefs threatens their sense of identity or their sense of belonging to a group. So if that conversation you're trying to have just isn't going the way you hoped it would, don't be too hard on yourself. Remember, you're kind of swimming upstream against human psychology and all that. You know what's actually more effective than facts and figures at getting people to change their mind, especially over time? Relationships. And that's the real reason why it's important to keep having these conversations, especially in your close circles, in your families, in your church groups or workplaces. It's where you have those invested long-term relationships where you can actually have this impact. Now, just because you're somebody's family member or a close friend, that doesn't mean you have this magic wand that's just going to get them to change their mind about things. That's not how it works. It still takes a series of conversations. It's not a one-time thing. It's a marathon, not a sprint. Use whatever metaphor you want. You know what I'm talking about because you've probably been in these conversations. But here's why, even though you're not changing somebody's mind right then and there, those conversations are still valuable. First, you introduce cognitive dissonance. You know what that is, right? Cognitive dissonance is this theory that people are highly motivated to have beliefs that all fit together, that are all in harmony with one another. And when we run into two ideas that just seem to conflict with each other, it creates this inner discomfort, and it forces us to reconsider what we actually believe. So let's say somebody thinks of Black Lives Matter as this extremist thing, because that's what the media they watch says, that's the main narrative. And then they run into you, and they love you, they've known you for years and years, they don't question your character. And you are pretty open about your support for their cause. that's dissonance. Those are two images of Black Lives Matter that don't seem to fit together. Now, even that won't change a person's mind overnight, but it does force them into a position of openness, of having to reconsider assumptions. And over time, that activity adds up. Another thing that you do is you change norms around how these conversations are held. Now, there are some people who I have a close relationship with who I frequently hear voice racist ideas and beliefs. And for a long time, my approach was to just keep my mouth shut, don't open Pandora's box, don't start this debate you know is going to be exhausting. Here's what the problem with that response. By remaining silent, I've unintentionally supported these ideas, even while disagreeing with them on the inside. You know, maybe that person, it's possible that they take it for granted I agree with them, because I haven't said otherwise. And maybe there's other people involved in the conversation who also think I agree, and if this is, you know, something that I'm not just doing, but other people are as well, it could turn the minority opinion into one that seems widely accepted. And if it's a harmful one, that's all the more dangerous. If you make it a habit of pointing out when you're not okay with something you heard, you are asserting your boundaries over what ideas you're willing to accept and which ones you find unacceptable. That's how norms are formed. There are ideas that today, you know, hardly anyone would dare speak aloud that 40, 50 years ago would have seemed fairly commonplace. And that's because conversation by conversation, we've renegotiated, we've reasserted what we're willing to accept and what we're not. And that work isn't done. Another big reason to keep speaking up, even when it seems unlikely that you're going to change the mind of the person you're speaking to, is for the sake of other people who are around you in that conversation. You know, maybe there's people who agree with you but tend to be silent about it, and their silence oftentimes, you know, takes momentum away from progress. Maybe there's people who are kind of on the fence of new ideas or undecided, but by hearing you articulate it in a clear and compelling way, will be convinced or moved or intrigued. Maybe there are people who just thought they were the only ones who held this dissenting belief, and now that you're speaking up, it's giving them encouragement and some motivation to do so themselves. You know, as a dad, I also know that my kid and other kids are watching, and I do want to set that example of what it's like to speak up at a time when that's especially important. You know, maybe one day he has to speak up to me. I hope that I'm not doing something that calls for that, but I want him to be able to if I am, you know? And then here's another one to think about. Maybe there's somebody else who's a part of the conversation who, like, let's say you're talking about Black Lives Matter, but there's another person of color in the conversation, and by you standing up for a cause that might be adjacent to something that they struggle with, they realize you've got their back, you know? Maybe there is a black person in the conversation, and it's really important for them to know you've got their back, and that it's not on them to be the ones who call out this stuff. So yeah, so much of the value of speaking up isn't necessarily with the main person you're engaged in the discussion with. Finally, if nothing else, if these strategic reasons aren't enough for you, just know that speaking up demonstrates your own honesty and integrity, and that you're being responsible to your convictions. And even if it doesn't make a lot of progress towards changing someone's mind, that counts for something. That's absolutely worth it and valuable. So if you've been having these conversations lately and they've been exhausting, I get it. You're not alone. So many people around the country. I read an article that said in the past 2 months, 70% of Americans have had conversations with their loved ones about race. That's mind-boggling to think about. And you can imagine that even though not everyone is resulting in a changed mind, this will add up and be something. Now, so when you feel discouraged, just remember that what you're doing counts for something. Even when it seems stuck or like you're not making progress, it's not a waste. It's good for your own soul. It's good for other people who are around you. And in the long run, it could be good for the person you're speaking to. Keep it up. Keep having these conversations. There's a lot more work that needs to be done. But just remember, because of who you are and because of the unique relationships that you have a role to play in the work that nobody else can fulfill. There are people who would have this conversation with you who would never pick up any of these books. So steward that role well. Stay encouraged. Keep at it.